Good evening, and welcome to the fourth episode of Woah's Wednesdays. Sorry about missing last week, but I was sick and therefore not up for doing a video. I'm back this week, and looking forward to doing more of these and continuing this being a weekly thing. So this week, continuing with the RPG theme, I was going to talk about role-playing game history. As many of you may know, one of the most famous role-playing games in all time was Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons is not necessarily the first role-playing game. There were a few others that were developed in parallel, I guess you would say, to Dungeons and Dragons. But it is definitely the first one that achieved any level of success. That said, Dungeons & Dragons is not the origin of role-playing games, so to speak. For one thing, for probably as long as humans have been alive, and we can even see it in other animals, there's this make-believe, imitate our parents, imitate workers, imitate people that we find in children in many different animal societies, and that would be the sort of central idea to role-playing games, so that's not new. But structured role-playing games actually evolved from wargaming. Now, the oldest war game that could potentially be mentioned is chess. But when we talk about wargaming, chess isn't really what we're talking about. That's kind of like a board game about strategy. When we talk about wargaming, we're talking about miniatures. Now, around 1900 or so is when there started to be this growing development of wargaming for reenactments of ancient battles. So you'd have Napoleon's army fighting, the French fighting the Russians or the Germans or some other nation, and that would be a very common war game early on. And as time went on, there became World War One war games, and then World War II war games. And at some point, people started developing fantasy war games. These were war games where people fought as heroes with spells and swords and stuff against orcs and ogres and other fantasy creatures, and this was it was a small but growing department or genre of wargaming. Some more modern versions of this are Warhammer 40k, Warhammer Fantasy, I believe Rune is one. There's a whole bunch of them. It's kind of exploded outwards. But from this, there were people who wanted to move further away from the miniatures and more into the characters. And this is where role-playing games started. It's the evolution of a role-playing game started with this divergence from wargaming, where there's the people who care about the miniatures and the tactics, and then there's the people who care about the characters and the story. And focusing on the characters and the story is what created the role-playing game. All role-playing games basically came from this idea of we're going to focus on the story and the characters. And we're going to, take these rules from wargaming and pull them out and build our characters with these rules, and then just focus on our characters. And we'll have somebody, instead of having two armies, we'll have a scenario master, a dungeon master, a game master, and then the players, who each control an individual guy. It's sort of a grotesque tactics miniatures game, but focusing on the characters more than the tactics. So, as D&D gained in popularity, other people joined in to create role-playing games, and there's a lot of different games that have been developed over the years. it you can kind of actually see the waves of role playing games through history, and you can tell just really but quickly by looking at the mechanics of a game about how old it is. Because as we've gone through iterations of role playing games and generations of role playing games, it's quite obvious how the mechanics and the rules and the writing have evolved. I don't know how many of you have looked at first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, but those rule books are a mess. The one section runs into another. The organization is minimal. The rules and like you'll have rules running straight into inventory, into equipment, into magic, and there's no clear organization. There's no clear theory of how they were going to design this game. They just wrote the book and published it. And then you got second edition AD&D. And to be honest, they really improved how they wrote the book. Some of the rules are still difficult, complicated, more convoluted than they might need to be, but the organization's a lot better when you move from first edition to second edition. At the end of second edition, you had, I guess this is more of a history of Dungeons and Dragons than a history of role-playing games, but Dungeons and Dragons is sort of one of the it's the conductor to role-playing games, I would say. It's it being like the mainstream role-playing game. It kind of sets trends, establishes a baseline, and sort of gives you the bottom line for what a role-playing game is going to be like. As I talked about in earlier videos, there are other kinds of games that have different focuses from Dungeons & Dragons. There's ones that focus much more on the storytelling than the mechanics. But there is not a storytelling game that has nearly the popularity of Dungeons & Dragons. It's not even comparable. Almost everyone has heard of Dungeons & Dragons. You can't go talk to a group of people and say, yeah, I play role-playing games. They may not understand that. They may have heard of role-playing games, but they won't necessarily know what that means. You say, yes, I play Dungeons & Dragons, immediate brand recognition, they know what you're talking about. So, there are very few things that have penetrated quite like Dungeons & Dragons have. But, you'll notice a very, sharp distinction between second edition Dungeons & Dragons and third edition Dungeons & Dragons. And one of the big changes was that TSR was bought up by Wizards of the Coast. And that change right there makes a huge difference, because it's no longer Gary Gygax publishing Dungeons & Dragons. It's no longer the original writers publishing it. It's another group has bought it, and they're designing the game. And they learned about second edition, and they found out what worked in it, and they decided what they did and didn't like, and what they did want to keep and what they didn't want to keep. And then they wrote third edition. And third edition is a step away from second edition. Basically everything changed. There's a lot of things that didn't, and if you've been a dedicated second edition player and you were to move to third edition, you would find it feasible to convert your character. It was close enough that you could move from one to the other without too much struggle. But third edition wasn't perfect, so they came out. But it was immensely popular, so they came out with 3.5. And 3.5 changed a few things. It was a lot more of a rules tweak than an overhaul. They didn't change nearly as much as they did from second edition to third edition. The 3.5 should kind of give you a tip that it's not going to be as different as from 2 to 3. That's not always true. Those of you who program in software know that 3.0 to 3.1 can be a bigger difference from 2.0 to 3, depending on how people do version control and how closely they stick to those numbers meaning anything. But that said, 3.5 was reasonably close to 3rd edition. They did some changes, updated a few things, and continued releasing books, expansions, etc. And then they came out with 4th edition. Oh, how those of us who liked earlier editions do not like to talk about that edition. 4th edition was a huge step away from anything that was like D&D prior to 4th edition. It was very, very similar to taking a MMO-style mechanic and trying to implement it in a tabletop role-playing game, which is kind of working backwards from how those things have previously worked. A lot of times what happens is that the role-playing game gets written, and then somebody makes a game that's an adaptation of the tabletop system. But with 4th edition, they went in reverse. Somebody was like, man, we love how WoW plays, so we're going to take WoW's ideas of mechanics and implement them in a tabletop game. It left a lot of us just shaking our heads. There are some newer players who came in when 4th edition was in its publishing phase, and they like 4th edition, but those of us who've been role-playing gamers for a while, tabletop gamers for a while, we shrug at those people, shake our heads, and continue on our way walking off. But 4th edition was a marginally successful system, and recently, last couple of years, we have 5th edition. And 5th edition is an interesting one, because they basically went back to all the other editions, and they went, what were the best parts of each? Let's take all the successful parts, leave all of the crummy parts out, and make an edition with that. And personally, I find that 5th edition plays a lot like how I like 2nd edition to play, and it's much similar to 2nd edition, and so I find it to be a much more enjoyable system overall. It's smoother, enjoyable, a little bit it's simpler than some of the other editions in that it doesn't have as much bloat. 3rd edition, you'd have feats and thousands of feats to choose from, and so many configurations of feats, and different feats had different rules depending on which book you pulled it from, and all sorts of different little things, and it was a mess. It was difficult to balance a character. It was difficult to determine if a particular build would work ahead of time because there were so many factors, and planning your character could take days or weeks. You want to make characters, you don't want to take forever making characters. Character creation on a simple system takes a while. 3rd edition made it with every new book. There were dozens of new feats. Every new feat adds new features. And so now I want to make a character. And while I appreciate the flexibility, it meant that I'm spending hours figuring out what feats I needed to do the character I wanted to make. And then I had to determine, is that character actually going to work? Because it may be that the character can do what I want it to, but it's not actually capable of performing in combat, or in socialization, or whatever, magic, whatever it was that I was building. So, it was a lot of research and development to make a character. 5th edition is a lot more like 2nd edition. You have your character, and you have your kits, and all of them work pretty well. It's more of a thematic change, and I mean, your abilities change with what you build, but they all function. None of them are like, I pick this, it works. I pick that, doesn't work at all. It's not a thing that happens in 5th edition. It generally, every character build works pretty well. So, there's some real perks to that system. But there are other role-playing games that are sort of working on similar approaches to character development, like Mutant Chronicles. There's so many role-playing games. I could list role-playing games for hours. They all tend to emphasize slightly different things, both in theme and mechanics. So it's sometimes hard to tell someone what the ideal system for them is. If there's a particular theme that you would like to hear about, I've probably read about or played a game in that theme and could probably talk about it for a while. You've got Legend of the Five Rings, which really is a politics game, but with an Asian samurai theme to it. You want a different politics game? You play Vampire the Masquerade. Very political game. The fact that you're all vampires with superpowers is nice and cool, but it's really designed to be played as a politics game. D&D... I want to say there is options for D&D political games, but most people don't play that way, and it's not exactly encouraged. So, I've gone on a tangent. Anyway, please let me know if you have anything you'd like me to talk about, role-playing game related or otherwise. I, look forward to hearing from you soon, maybe. Anyway, it's been nice talking with you guys, and I'll see you guys later.